When you look out of your window in the morning, having opened up those curtains, have you ever asked yourself, where is the GDP growth? Can you see it? Whether that's looking to your neighbour who's just bought a new car due to a promotion at work, or across the street to where there's new businesses open up, dynamic and interesting enterprises on your high street, or in the skyline of your town where perhaps there's cranes building new buildings. And I know, right? Maybe you're not seeing that. And if you can't see it, you should be able to hear it. Be it the hum of delivery trucks going to and fro, the enterprises making new machine parts in factories, and in the cheers of happy customers outside. But no, we're not maybe hearing it either. And if you can't hear it, you should be able to smell it in the freshly baked bread in the morning, and the smells of construction materials serenading your nose as vigorous new GDP growth is happening. Or maybe instead all you're smelling is weed and crime, because weed is the only crime that you can smell. Okay, so maybe if you can't smell GDP growth and you can't hear it, if you can't touch it and you can't see it, where the fuck is it? This video tells you where it is and how you can sniff it out for yourself. This comes at the same time as news from the United States that the GDP figures have actually shrunk by 0.3%. It's big news right now. The first quarter 2025 figures are in. And what we're talking about today is what they're not telling you about the GDP. And what do you see outside your window? First, before we get into any more nitty-gritty on this, let's check in with the President Donald Trump and what he has to say about this.
Core GDP, and this is, you probably saw some numbers today, and I have to start off by saying that's Biden, that's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy, destroying our country in so many ways. Not only at the border was more obvious, but we took over his mess in so many different ways. Core GDP, removing distortions from imports, inventories, and government spending, was up plus 3% when you add it.
So we're hearing that GDP is up plus 3% from Donald Trump, but that's because they're just taking a look at certain parts of the calculation. In today's show, the key takeaways are as follows, and this is what you will be able to say confidently that you know all about by the end of today's show. GDP growth, which is often invisible locally. GDP and what this actually here means. The local reality versus abstract data. The smell test. And you'll understand this story about the patchwork economy and how often nowadays that Hollywood dream ends up in a basement. We'll be looking at the low GDP figures. And are they a signal for potential? And we'll be looking at growth and how it has phases and pockets with the overall goal of reading the real signs. And before anybody panics with regards to the latest GDP figures coming out of the United States, here we have the 12-month United States GDP chart. As you can see, the United States goes up and it goes up and it goes up. Every single one of these dots, apart with the exception of just a couple. We look back to 2008, look back to 2020. There was a little bit of a shrink here and a little bit of a shrink there. But one way or the other, ladies and gents, it's very difficult to describe this chart as anything other than straight up. So how do you reconcile this information about the news you hear all the time about GDP growth? And when you look outside of your window, what do you see? Do you see GDP growth? I have a poll right now in the chat box, which you are invited to take part in, which asks you that very question. Can you see GDP growth with your own eyes where you are? Take part in the poll. We'll be ending that in a couple of minutes. So far, I think we're seeing no at 52%. But do we even understand what these figures are? So, as I say, the key ideas that we're covering here, understanding GDP seems straightforward, but it often throws up surprises. And you'll also have in this video 5 really interesting key points about GDP that you probably don't already know, which will help you understand what's going on in the world. And we have an exclusive here, along with the 5 amazing facts about GDP and the patchwork economy story that we're helping explain here in today's show. We also have a story that nobody else is putting out there right now, really, which will explain why the US GDP has shrunk by 0.3% in the Q1 2024, and we'll give you a good idea about where the GDP figures could be going next. So stay tuned for all of that in today's amazing show. So when we're looking at these figures from the US, we're showing that the GDP actually has shrunk. And we'll touch on why that is going to have happened, and we'll be taking a look at global trade and policy, anticipated tariffs heading into the import rush, how they can skew the numbers. But what makes up this GDP growth that they normally talk about? Broadly, it's 4 things. Broadly, it is 4 things. It's all the stuff that people like us buy: groceries, cars, haircuts. Economists call that consumption. And we'll be just taking a quick note of that word, consumption. And we will remember the word by marking it with a C. It's what businesses are building and investing in: new machines, factories, software, the buildings, the warehouses. That is investment. So we'll just mark that with an I. There's also another big part of GDP, and it's what the government spends on public services. You're talking about your roads, your schools, hospitals, government spending, all right? All of that government spending, and there's so much of it. And we're going to mark that in with a G. And finally, in these 4 things which happen, seem that my video has stalled. Oh, my video. We will adapt, folks. We will adapt and survive. We don't need to worry about the video because it will return to us in no time at all. What I tell you. And finally, in these 4 things, it's the difference between what our country sells abroad, exports, and what We buy from them. Imports. Creating net exports. That's how it's called. It's called net exports. Net exports. I know. And you'll be watching this thinking, this is such a hot topic right now. Because this touches on ideas like deficits in the economy. And isn't it interesting that the word from economics is net exports as opposed to net imports, which is the situation that the US usually finds itself in overall, with a net exports figure in there being positive or negative, even I should say negative. So that equals C, just so we can remember here, C plus I plus G, plus I plus G plus NX. That is the four things that we're going to remember. So, if you can't hear it, you can't see it, you can't smell it, then we don't have that much tangible evidence of that activity, which is, apparently ramping up where you are overall normally, apart from this quarter, which is the first quarter of GDP shrinkage in the USA since 2022. And the major question here stands, and this is one of the things, of course, from the key takeaways that you'll get answers this question, is this supposed GDP growth that you've normally had so often and this GDP shrinkage that we're having this quarter. When I get up in the morning and I open up my curtains and then I look outside, I ask myself, if I can't see it, I can't smell it, I can't touch it, I can't hear it, where the fuck is it? We'll aim to answer that. And to do so, the answer starts here. That GDP does not equal your local reality. So what is GDP? First and foremost, just so you know, it's gross domestic product. And what it is a great big number. And for better or for worse, these big numbers can be used for political purposes or to manipulate you to spin a certain story which is or isn't true. And without fully understanding what these things actually are, how it's all tallied up, and why you can't see it out your own feckin' window, I think we need to dive into understanding exactly what this means. And that's what you're going to get right here in today's show. And what that gross domestic product figure does is it sums up all of the activity across the entire country. The things that I mentioned earlier on, such as the buzz of businesses opening up next door to you, the neighbor that bought the new car, the planes that are flying in, and the cranes that are lifting blocks up to build new buildings. Every single last thing, when you tot it all up, including everything that you import and everything that you export, we get your figure when we do the math on that one. And that is your gross domestic product figure. But it's an average, and therefore it is an abstraction away from what you see very likely out of your window. It tells you the total size of the pie. That is all of the C plus the I plus the G and whatever NX figure results after you add up the value of your exports and subtract the value of your imports. But what the GDP figure doesn't tell you is how it's sliced, where the slices are, who's getting the slices, if your slice is mostly crust, and we're going to break this down, and we're going to start by taking a look at what an official GDP figure is. So we covered this just a second ago, and let's break that down in a bit more detail. So it's GDP, and thanks very much to those who are helping take us towards our goal. We have a goal here, 5. If we get 5 donos, orange donos, we'll take a look at the SPX technical analysis in today's show. We'll set up for more goals and always aim to, of course, exceed those expectations. So what can we discover if we dig into the SPX charts? And the next goal will be Bitcoin, of course. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. That is your official GDP figure. It boils down to a simple formula at the end of it all. So your entire lives, the productivity that you and your parents and your parents' parents and everybody all contributed to gets boiled down to one simple little number. And how they get that is by adding up all of that household consumption, which is the C, household spending, really, typically speaking, your consumers out there. That's every roll of toilet roll and iPhone that you buy, all of that. You've got your I, which is all that business investment. You've got your G, which is all that government spending. And you've got the net exports minus imports. That's the difficult thing to remember, I suppose, out of all 4 of these. But as you can see, it's a fairly simple formula overall. It's what economists use. And they put one number on the total value of it all for the whole country. So you've basically just learned how GDP is calculated without all of the pain of having to pick up a textbook. And you might be starting to understand as well that GDP being a broad national figure can obviously leave certain areas behind. Some areas will run ahead with growing GDP figures that actually exceed those national averages. So when you hear GDP growth in the US last year was 2%, and you look outside your window in Michigan or Cleveland or Illinois and you ask about what happened to my zip code, why is my postcode determining my future and my fate more than my potential and more than my parents, more than my education, more than any gosh darn thing that I can actually do in my life to access that American dream. Why on earth is it that my zip code, more than anything else, determines how much of that big pie that I'll be getting? You'll understand a lot more about that as we go through today's show. And what you'll be understanding, of course, is the patchwork economy. You've got an uneven distribution of these factors, C, I, G, N, X. You've got high GDP and the high cost trap, which I'm calling in today's show the Hollywood basement dream. You'll understand why in a minute. And then you've got low GDP stagnation. And what we really need to understand is where exactly does C plus I plus G plus NX actually land? And here's the critical part of it all, is that connecting that formula back to your window so that what you can see outside can be actually understood, so you can see what's going on with GDP growth and where is it happening at. I've got a really interesting story about GDP growth in the United Kingdom today to share with people, which goes a long way to explaining how you can have neutral or stable or growing GDP in a town whose high streets are dying. This is a story that we know in the US and the UK like the back of our hands as we watch businesses, which are good businesses, run well, closing down. And we have to ask ourselves again, why is it, once again, that the success metric here that mattered more than anything was a zip code? Things don't happen equally everywhere, and there is an uneven distribution of all the spending and investment across the whole country. And that is exactly what creates the patchwork economy. And this is why the national number can feel absolutely disconnected. There's a shape you may well know and love very well. There's another shape that people may well know and love very, very well. And they'll hear amazing things such as 2.8% GDP growth applying to this whole country from north to south and east to west. But we know that the reality is very, 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 very different to that. Catastrophically different in some cases. We know that growth over here in this particular basket is likely to be closer to 5.8%. And we know that growth in this particular basket is actually much more likely to be 0%. And that's why whenever you add the numbers together, you end up getting the national figure of 2.8%. We know this is true, and that there is, of course, gravity wells of GDP growth and traps of GDP stiflement, and that the headline figure adds up to, in our lives, no matter what way you cut it, whether you're living in Palo Alto or Cleveland, to be a lie either way that you cut it. We know that down here, in this region of the United Kingdom, that growth is, again, it's going to be north of 4%. And we also know that over here in the northeast of England, that growth, GDP growth, hard figures, data backing all this up, is scheduled to come in at negative 1.6% this year. Minus 1.6% here versus a figure over here of 4%, creating a patchwork economy. So the national number feels disconnected. Some areas might actually attract huge amount of investment, creating those high-paying jobs. We're looking at Palo Alto. We're looking at London, the city. Average GDP per capita in the city of London, £566,000, about $700,000. Average GDP per capita in the city of London. North London, average GDP per capita, £26,000. Yeah. Even within certain regions, there's a spectrum that can cover 20x in the average, 20x in the average, because in that £26,000 average area, people earning nothing, on debt, paying out money just to be alive, taxes coming in, credit card bills going out. What you got? Negative. And in that other area, there's multi-millions. And there is a patchwork economy. Now, some areas then, when they get that investment, because they're already looking pretty good. That's a winning bet over there. There's people moving there because they hear that there's good GDP. So the businesses think, where am I going to invest? Here or there? Where everyone's moving to, I'll invest over there. They get better infrastructure. They get better investment. They get better, higher paying jobs. And that boosts local consumption, C, in that area. But it does also drive up housing costs, which leads to a modern phenomena, because there's people watching this right now, for instance, from San Diego, who are looking at the rents that they get, the salary. They're thinking about the numbers they heard as a child, thinking this salary figure that I'm getting right now should be good. And then they're also looking at their outgoings in their life and thinking, I can hardly make ends meet. It's a type of modern Californication. It's a Hollywood basement dream scenario. It looks good on paper, but it's very hard to live in. In the 1990s and 1980s, people would talk about a kind of stereotype. Often a young, vulnerable woman, but everybody did it, men and women alike, seeking a better future, moving out to Hollywood to try and get in the movies, could be the next star. We know that Hollywood dream went from the silver screen to a tabletop to ending up being filmed in a basement. But it's not contained anymore inside a Hollywood dream that we can look to and think, well, that was a risky venture to begin with. Very few people make it. Instead, we're seeing this spread across all sorts of industries, all sorts of cities. And some do make it, some do make it, and they get into the rat race and they go right to the top, and then others are counting their chips, down on their luck, getting filmed in a basement. That's the reality often of the experience for people in the Californication of the modern economy. Now, other areas might see very little new investment, very low consumption. Maybe they rely heavily on government spending. That's that G again, which might not drive private sector growth, leading to stagnation. Because less people are getting on that bus. So the bus company can't afford to put the bus on every day. So then the people that live there often don't catch the bus to work. So then they lose their job, no longer needing the bus the next day, until one day the bus company thinks, we just don't have enough passengers getting the bus here to even have a bus route. Now those people can't even get to their jobs. They can't walk there, they can't get the bus, and they certainly can't afford a car or the petrol to put in it. That happens. It's a real story, and it leads to a layered growth, acceleration of deprivation for communities. It is often a capitalist thing to invest wisely in a holistic way, addressing the lifestyle needs of certain communities in order to drive that growth and create the actual self-replicating consumer growth model as laid out by the likes of Keynes and White, who was indeed a Soviet spy, but still back in that woods in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods, whenever we came up with all these agreements, the ideas that we were coming up with back then did involve an element of understanding the social growth capitalist model. And then it was heavily employed by the United States over a long period of time. Stay tuned to my channel to explore all these sorts of concepts in great detail over the coming weeks and months. Be sure to hit that bell. When these areas see less investment and rely more on government spending, send out all those wrong signals to the businesses. They don't invest there, and then it leads to stagnation. And they've also got that net exports component, right? It can cause big swings too. Think back now to the surprising US figure here of 0.3% growth and contraction, negative 0.3% growth. And the obvious thing to look to then as part of our formula, which is not making headlines around the world, is of course to the imports element. Here we have the FT managing to get a bit of a scoop on a story here along with us. It was largely the result of companies' rush to buy goods from abroad ahead of the US president's sweeping tariffs, with imports rising at an annualized rate of 41%, which led to a fall in the GDP rating. And where, though, is the explanation so that when you look out of your window in the morning for those cranes, for the smells of that new enterprise, and instead all you can smell is crime, you're wondering, how do we link these things together? And of course, is what we're talking about here. The huge surge in imports led to a shifting in the CIGNX equation. Why would imports suddenly surge? Why would they surge? Because of imports. Ahead of the tariffs. It's been in the news as well. We have this story about tariffs. The stockpiling that's happened has boosted the US goods trade deficit to a record high. This was a news story that we got a day ago. And it is indeed this dynamic which has led to the impact on the GDP figures. Goldman Sachs going as far as to say that they can see GDP contracting at a 0.8% annualized rate. JP Morgan forecasts output declining at a 1.75% pace. This is in comparison to figures where we see a 2.4% rate of growth in the previous fourth quarter. And of course, the major response initially was to do with how this is to do with Biden, but that is actually not the answer. The answer, as we're exploring and understanding here, is to do with how there's been a huge surge in imports because of the looming tariffs that are coming in. And another reminder to folks that the de minimis exemption should be ending this week for people, so beware of that if you are importing from abroad, anywhere abroad. So even if C and I and G were okay, a massive temporary jump in imports makes the X minus the M, the net exports calculation, sharply negative. Equally, even if C and I and G were doing terribly, and when you looked out your window you saw it, and when you looked at your payslip you felt it, if the net imports figure were going the other direction, you would see positive GDP figures. It's entirely reasonable to think that following the largest deficit period because of Trump-related tariffs, we might see the flip side of that equation, given a big jump to future GDP figures. And this is because of that figure, that equation. And this shows how trade policy fears can distort the imports figure and therefore impacts the NX figure and therefore impacts overall GDP. And we can see that if GDP goes down, it impacts the dollar price, and overall a drop in dollar price is what Trump would really like, because it's the primary measure that he has to try and affect the long-standing trade deficit that America has. However, because, as explained in the last video, and do check out the last video where I explain bonds and the reserve currency status, what goes hand in hand with the exorbitant privilege of being the only country in the world that, reasonably speaking, would never expect it to default, has great interest rates and a wonderful climate for a credit-based consumer society. You'll also understand if you then think about that and how we have seen sensitivity towards GDP figures as a result in shifting elements in the components that have made up the equation up to this point. But the hands of the US are tied with regards to directly getting involved in their currency value as the world's reserve currency. Just looking at the FX markets alone, for example, when you see so many currencies traded against the dollar, when you see gold against the dollar, oil and Bitcoin all traded against the dollar, that is a massive privilege on the one hand, and of course it limits what you can do, and you can't directly manipulate your own currency. Definitely not as the world reserve currency. So the only options they have available to you are ones which will, in order to reduce the price of the dollar, are other ones, such as impacting the GDP figures, creating uncertainty in markets, changing landscape for policy, making fundamental changes, hiring people to work in departments that are not given well-respected and regarded reviews of their work around the world, doing things like allowing national security secrets to be shared on Signal, and so on. All of these things have a negative impact on the price of the US dollar, which is fantastic and on policy, part of the mandate of the president and his part of his manifesto leading into election, except unlike France, he can't get involved, or China I should say probably, he can't get involved in manipulating the currency, but they can. So how do you do it? So this is one of the components which is really important to understand, and understanding the sensitivity of GDP with regards to shifts in these components is really empowering for somebody who is subject to news headlines and also who wants to be able to understand what particularly is going on. One of the handy things about understanding these things is that when you do understand all of the negative backdrop, and you're doing it in a non-partisan, non-political way, purely understanding and respecting economics for personal and community growth here to create a rising tide of independent, strong investors, that when we look outside our windows, we can see that GDP growth that we're looking for. And by the way, it's not all some of it's hidden, and we'll explain that with the interest in UK news articles, so stay tuned for that. But it does help explain some of this stuff, which we also hear, and makes it so that it's easier to understand the positive side of the story without being subjecting yourself to some sort of like, oh, this is just spin, this is just selectively telling us the bits that only look good, because we can understand the bits that don't look so good and why they exist and why they're there, as we have done with regards to the NX component.
We had numbers that despite what we were handed, we turned them around, and we were getting them really turned around. Gross domestic investment was a whopping 22%. Now, that is a number that people are coming in at numbers. For instance, I just walked in, I heard Samsung is now, because of the tariffs, they're going to build massive facilities in the United States. If we didn't do the tariffs, they wouldn't be doing that. So it takes a little while to get those facilities built, but they're coming in with big, big numbers. They're all coming in with big numbers. We have more money being spent than at any time in the history of our country. We're up to close to $8 trillion, I think I can say. And really, it's going to be a lot higher than that. Those are just the ones that we know about. 8 trillion.
So you can see how the negative headline of 0.3% contraction in the economy went to a 0.3% growth figure when Trump was talking about it initially, and then grew up to a figure of 8 trillion. But understanding how that actually impacts on these GDP figures allows us to see the full side of the story. And of course, when he's talking about those investment numbers, that would be the I component of the our formula. And of course, as well, when you look at the impact on NX, that's to do with tariffs as well. Big part of that's to do with tariffs, which increased the imports, as counterintuitive as that might seem, which then made GDP go negative. And then, of course, the impact on the consumer is you've got much less spending that you're able to do. And the impact on the government with the policies recently has been, of course, to massively cut government spending, which does impact on the patchwork. And we can see then that one of the natural outcomes, thanks very much for that there, and to the audience for the support, and I will be checking all those in just a minute. Thank you. What you can see here then, of course, that leads to when you have no socially directed investment in a capitalist way in order to grow and create new GDP growth, that is going to have to lean into the existing beneficiaries from the patchwork, and then of course leave those which have got the degrading inefficient areas to continue to degrade and get worse, given the lack of an ability to patch up any missing gaps in the economy there, because the free market economy isn't going to invest its capital in an inefficient manner in an area that's experiencing contraction, which leads to this increased emphasis on these dynamics where the country overall will impose policies that lead to a positive net figure on the GDP, which will increase and emphasize the GDP growth and the disparity between the two areas through the patchwork system, which they have to lean into when they've got exceedingly low G figure. And that will, of course, leave a lot of the 0% areas or the negative growth areas in a harder situation in the future as a result of that. So there is obviously shifting dynamics in this. And it isn't just simply, of course, in the sense of building products and things like that. There's an awful lot more to it than just that. So let's take a quick detour and ask the question, when it comes to seeing how much does manufacturing contribute to GDP? I think I've probably spelt this really badly. So this can be as well a poll for the audience, and in that previous poll to see what the results were just now and setting up a new one. This will be a quick fire poll. Under 12%, say, for example, under 24%, over 76%. Hope people appreciate my slightly odd number style. Just so that you can hopefully pick somewhere on that list. You know, where do you think that it adds? How much do you think that adds to the economy? In the meantime, we're going to ask a few other questions among ourselves in this patchwork. Where is the different figures near you? See, consumer spending. Are those high streets empty? Where is the investment figure near you? Are you seeing businesses moving into your area? Is there growth in corporation tax payments and so on there? Are there entrepreneurs? And take a look at G and NX as well, and ask yourself, like, how much is going on? How much can be afforded to go on? And are we in a negative cycle or a positive cycle trend overall in terms of the affordability of achieving growth in those areas? And while we're thinking about those questions, I'll just bring up a little bit about that disparity that I spoke about with regards to the patchwork and where it leaves people. And of course, one of the examples I mentioned in terms of where things are pretty good GDP wise is over here in Palo Alto. And for a 3-bedroom house, looking at that one, seems fairly standard. These are fairly standard looking houses. You're looking at 3 million. And if we just compare this to sort of standard looking houses over here in Cleveland, they don't look massively different in terms of what you're getting for your money. That's right. 10% of the price, 1% of the price. It's been on there for 6 days. They're looking for $25,000 for their 3-bedroom house. And you can see that there, of course, is huge disparities in GDP, but also huge disparities in the cost of accessing that GDP. And what you end up with, of course, is a lot of people using their wealth to bid on access to GDP, which is the way that the government does it when it does it cheap, is that it extracts the risk element from its own operations, and it focuses and it extracts it reduces its costs, its spending, by focusing on areas where it's cheaper to do so because they already have the efficiencies in place, which then creates this spiraling patchwork effect, which then of course drives people to bid with their own wealth to get access to that GDP. And that's how the government is actually managing the economy. And you think about, well, growth in GDP, what actually is that? Because in order to buy this $3 million house, you need to have somebody nearby who's earning more than $3 million through their own production contribution to GDP in order to be able to afford that house. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that price. This is a real price for a real house. So where is it coming from? Where is that money coming from? And this is where some of the traps and the what can happen whenever there's extended periods of austerity, which is the word that is often used by governments who are cutting back on that social spending. And I don't mean social spending just like, giving kids colouring crayons or something like that, or setting up sports meets or whatever, although that's all good, generally speaking, pretty good for the GDP as well, actually. But what I'm actually talking about there is directing infrastructure, building a bridge towards an area that's deprived so that better refrigerated lorries can cross over the bridge to provide them with better infrastructure there, so that their whole overall quality of life improves, so that more teachers want to live there, so that the schools get better, so that the quality of life improves, so that better, higher skilled workers want to live there because their kids will get a good education, so their consumption figures can go up, which makes more businesses move in and creates a positive virtuous cycle. And that's obviously the ideal, but the interesting UK news coming out of the UK here, which is incredibly surprising to a lot of people, is that buy-to-let firms, right, become the UK's biggest single type of business. This is new news overall, right? This is news. It's new news. This website wants to complain and say it's more than 1 month old, but this is news, 2025 news, and it's not the sort of news that just flip-flops and changes overnight. 4 times more buy-to-let firms than fast food shops now registered at Companies House. So if you're looking up their high street and you're asking, this town sucks, I want to move out of this town doesn't even have an In-N-Out burger in it. If this town had an In-N-Out burger, then I would live here, but I'm leaving. And you're asking about the question, there is no entrepreneurs doing that. Instead, they've been convinced growing up watching TikTok videos about the benefits of passive income, that what they want to do instead is set up a buy-to-let firm, or even worse, a rent-to-let firm, where they rent a house and then sublet it. And if you're looking out that window and asking, where is the GDP growth? And actually that GDP growth is shrinking. And that GDP growth is shrinking, and the best businesses and the most growing businesses are those who are simply reselling access to housing and not real entrepreneurs at all. then it goes an awfully long way to understanding why that window that you're looking at of is actually getting smaller. And as opposed to you seeing any growth outside the window, what you're seeing is the 3-bedroom house that you used to live in has had new stud walls put up in a 3-week sprint by a rent-to-let landlord, and it's become a house of multiple occupancy, and there's now 12 people living there, and the size of your window has gone down by a quarter. And it also goes a long way to explaining why there ain't no fast food outlet in that town that you're at. Here's another one. There's more of them than there are hairdressers. 4 times as many people making money from doing nothing as there are hairdressers making money from the unusual kind of productivity of cutting hair, which goes a long way to answering the question of why don't hairdressers cut hair any longer? And it's not because the hairdressers are cutting your hair shorter, folks. It's because your hairdresser is now letting out an Airbnb. This is shocking figures. And you can see this chart here, and it goes a long way to explaining how there's hidden GDP growth. Sometimes it's part of a healthy, natural shift in the various components, and it creates, through the free markets, its own layer of efficiency to redirect capital to where it's most efficiently used. That's the free markets. That's Reaganism. That's Thatcherism. That's what the free markets will do for you. But then whenever you sack 20,000 workers out of a t-shirt factory and just say that they'll be able to reskill, what you actually find is that the person who is expert at sewing isn't super fast at becoming a social media brand manager for a pizza shop. And the pizza shop is thinking to itself, hey, I'll get more money if I just let out the townhouses on the street that I live on and don't even bother doing entrepreneurship anymore. So back over to the stream again, and to end the poll and ask, what sort of GDP and how much does manufacturing contribute to it? And we can see that the results are in, and that you were actually right. The audience has done the right thing. Well done, audience. Well done, audience. So how much does manufacturing contribute to GDP? And the answer really is that in the United States, at best, it's 12%. It's actually more like 11%. Really. And the figures for the UK in terms of how much manufacturing contributes to the economy is closer to 8%, which might be a bit of a surprise to people. And it does also make you wonder exactly where that 8 trillion figure is going and how it's going to impact the CIGNX figures here with regards to GDP. Although, of course, investment of any form is always massively appreciated. Oops. So understanding which components are weak and why can help an awful lot. And the question is, well, does the area that you're from having perhaps a relatively shit GDP mean that there's bad news, or is it actually a signal for those free markets that there is a need? I think business, more than tariffs on the consumers, which knock down the C number and in order to increase GDP, I think what consumers need is to remember the power of the consumer in the free market economy, and what business need is to start actually recognizing the advice that we've had from the likes of Stoic masters, Greek philosophers 2,000 years ago, who rightly pointed out that the problem is the solution. It if people are wanting to leave an area because the GDP is not good enough there, and if businesses are not wanting to open up on the high street, then the answer there seems to the reactionary as to run away and invest in somewhere that has easier efficiency, or to turn your business model from one that includes risk to the least risk possible. But then all ultimately you do is hollow out the soul of the economy internally. And instead, what you should do is to look at that as a signal for profit. If people say they need buses, then get that bus company set up and bring them to work on time. If people say that they need jobs, what you're hearing is that you've got a labor force there ready to turn up to work. And it's a signal to business and enterprise. And in a time when the social spending is being cut back in all of the developed countries in the world, really, I think it's a good time to remind businesses that a shit GDP and a brain drain in a local economy is a profit signaling mechanism to anybody who's able to satisfy the people, because we all know the story of this, having experienced these things in our own lives, that we're not seeking to run away. We actually all want to build. We just need the tools to be able to do so in the areas that we're from. So we need to point as well about where there is intervention or change, how you can do more to attract investment and boost skills for better jobs, which can drive consumption, which could then unlock investment, and whether or not the G is being effectively applied. And this is one of the reasons why you need to think about your own politics in your local areas and what the mandate that you're giving your politicians is, and the manifesto that they're being elected on, in order to drive any of those independent factors of that in your local area. In terms of the overall big picture, of course, you know, it isn't for the president to be concerned about the individual area in a you know how government works. You know, it's your local municipality which is driving or else throttling this growth, and we need to encourage not risk but the awareness that there is, of course, a profit signaling mechanism here if there is the right investment in the things that lead to growth, which of course is about skills and access, transport, so on, infrastructure. And then for yourself, what this allows you to do is to make an assessment of the area that you're in, and to be able to either perhaps for business and entrepreneur people out there to see the opportunities which exist in the pain points in the local economy. If you can understand the interaction between these areas in your local economies, then you might be able to help rectify some of these other problems that exist in the world, such as in our patchwork map. If you're anywhere that is in the 0% area, then perhaps there's a component there that is 0% in that state and 5.8% in another, because of the imports and exports that are going between those different states. And are they working efficiently? And are you leaning into the local areas of your own skills to extract the best wealth of the state domestically in order to drive up GDP figures? Because ultimately everybody wants to drive up GDP figures, and that of course politically people are focused currently on the NX figure, and it isn't working out. And as right now, as you can see with the impact it's had, despite the positive CI and G on the GDP figures. And of course other ways of influencing this can manipulate the figures you're able to report publicly about the overall GDP figures without actually diving into the detail on any of the C, I, G, and NX. And this is the sort of thing that enables you to be able to be better informed about whether or not your local municipality is creating a high GDP area without the high cost trap, so that people don't end up chasing a Hollywood basement dream, and that they also don't underinvest or do it poorly or inefficiently to create a low GDP stagnation area, because free market economy businesses are not going to come in and build the infrastructure in an area to create growth in the longer term. That's not just a function of the free market economy, which is always seeking to place its capital in the most efficient area. And then I think when those things are understood, then you can understand that growth often happens in phases. It focuses on different parts of that C, I, G, NX equation. That growth can often happen in the form of building buildings, to create some base layer, and then providing the jobs to people with that higher GDP so that they can afford to buy that concrete off those builders. And then when their consumer habits change and they're not interested in buying concrete anymore, but live in that lifestyle, as I spoke about at the start of the show, about how lifestyle is so important when it comes to understanding the GDP figures that you're seeing out your window, that they start to be able to afford more and consume in their local economies. And I think that this can be seen quite clearly if we think about China again, and the story of the last 4 decades really of China, of people moving away from the cities, or from the rural areas to the cities. You've heard about this. And you think, why are they moving from the rural areas to the cities? Well, you know the answer. It's because there's a higher GDP in those cities than there is in the rural areas due to the patchwork economy that existed in China for a long time. They moved to areas, and what industry was there initially? Just building stuff, infrastructure. What did they get after they built the infrastructure? Started building factories, giving people jobs. What did they get after that? They had money in their pocket. What did they start to do? Started to consume. China now has a bigger, in nominal terms, in absolute terms, and in terms of how many people, China now has a bigger working class than the US. There's more people who can afford to buy that car that you can't afford to buy, and that phone you can't afford to buy, who can drop an extra few bucks here on some roses for their wife, or a nice bigger birthday cake for their kid than China, than there is in the US. And it isn't just because of some import-export dynamic. It's because you have to look at the CIGNX components and put money where it works. I was considering, rather than calling this the patchwork economy, to instead look at this and talk about a siphoning effect that happens. But I don't think that that's fair, because that's adversarial, and that good businessmen know that actually it's about networking and growth, and about finding the individual skills and strengths within each individual state in America, or individual parts of the country in Scotland and so on, and attracting other forms of investment and money flows, including tourism. One of the big things that China's been doing over the last decade is trying to improve its tourism. And we're seeing that that is, of course, a latter stage element of the CIGNX matrix when it comes to improving your GDP without actually needing to have people do something like work in a factory and so on. And that creates investment, which creates jobs, which boosts consumption. And that is the I that can boost the C. And if you get the I boosting that C, and you need that I building structures and so on, but ultimately you need people with good incomes driving that C, and that's to buy and use what's being built or manufactured. And that interplay is especially between investment and consumption, and that is the primary focus of developed economies, is to look at the dynamics between investment and consumption, which is why we see the primary role of the Fed to be looking at a low figure for inflation, not negative though, a low positive figure for inflation, which encourages and spurs investment, because spend today for a better tomorrow is the best way to avoid inflation impact. And they also look at high employment. Why? Because high employment means dollars in your pocket, which means high levels of consumption, which is why the Fed's mandate is to look at the interaction between monetary supply and interest rates and how it affects inflation and high employment in order to maximize consumption, whilst maximizing the impact of investing today versus tomorrow, and maintain a degree of wealth and stability within the currency value itself through high GDP and growth figures. Let's circle back one last time then here, looking at this, and ask the question, the perennial question, the question we started out with here, right? Where the fuck is the GDP growth that we started looking for? And it's not just one thing that you can point at. It's the sum total of C plus I plus G plus NX across the whole country. It's a figure that can be skewed by things like the pre-tariff import figures is a figure which does not necessarily represent local reality. It has an impact on you. It is visible from your window, but that isn't just in one thing or a romanticized view on the contribution of the 12% of manufacturing towards the overall GDP figures. It does require employing a nuanced understanding of where GDP is coming from and what's driving growth, and whether or not that is effective for driving more growth, because growth should beget growth. In the UK, we have the interesting dynamic right now of growth begetting smaller bedrooms in what used to be single-family homes becoming homes of multiple occupancy. And you're seeing similar stories where you are too, where the GDP is not the real GDP, which doesn't add to the value chain or indeed create new ones. And that's why we need to look at the phases in the GDP figures and where they're derived from and what contributes to those, and how the focus shift then between investment and consumption and government spending over time in certain areas, and where you're seeing dividends on that leading to growth and attracting more from the free markets, and where you're seeing where that's become stagnated over time, perhaps reaching a bottom in certain areas where they can then spring back from. But we know as well that once the chokehold of the negative cycle of GDP deprivation really takes a hold of a particular smaller municipality, that can often end up with a siphoning of the people away from one area to another so that they can try and compete in the Hollywood basement dream of modern GDP contribution on the per capita, that's you and I, that's me and you, basis. And sometimes it's hidden in the potential, which is revealed by understanding what parts of the CIG or NX matrix are missing locally and why, and to understand, of course, that the problem is the solution. And that's where a gap exists in the market. It's the classic way of identifying it, and it is where true entrepreneurial spirit resides, because, of course, there's an element of risk, but the investment is, of course, so powerful. And the way that it contributes to the improvement of the lifestyle in the local area is directly what improves to the contribution towards GDP, because GDP is a holistic thing and it's what contributes to your own bottom line. So it's a great profit signaling mechanism for those who are willing to do it. It often requires instead that the government comes in and takes control of social spending in order to understand, to make the investments that are needed. And the next time that you draw back that curtain, maybe just don't look outside, but analyze what it is that you're seeing and ask the question, do you see how GDP growth can be invisible locally? Do you see and understand now at this stage, having gone through all these different things, the formula behind GDP and how consumption plus investment plus government spending plus the net figure when you add up all your exports and then subtract all your imports, and how that makes GDP? You'll understand the local reality in your area versus the abstract data. You'll be able to smell out using the different pieces of the pie that we've talked about here, exactly where that GDP is and whether or not it's something, like this figure that we talked about with regards to buy-to-let firms and how they really impact the value chain. You can understand then whether or not entrepreneurial spirit is the thing that really needs to kick up the bum when it comes to improving the GDP in your local area. Also think about the internal dimension of your country's individual states and whether or not they're operating with the best outcomes in mind, from the lessons that we learned from Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations, and of course in other things such as understanding his principles of social economics as well. That's in terms of understanding what liberty means, of course. the patchwork economy and the Hollywood basement dream was fairly well explained, I think, overall. And what that adds up to is where exactly CIGNX lands for you, and of course the particular details of that, and whether or not it's trending up or trending down. You should be able to sniff that out now. Or the one easy way of abstracting the overall lesson that I've given today is to say that by the end of this, you'll be able to understand not only what GDP is, but how you can measure it by looking at how many empty seats there are on your local bus. You'll understand that it comes in phases and pockets, that it goes between structures and jobs and demand, that every one of these things is a chain that leads either into positive or negative cycles. You'll be able to question the official story and measure that against your local reality. But also, as I said here, you'll be able to understand the spin and why you might hear one story from the politicians which focus on the positive aspects, which juxtaposes against the negative ones, and be able to see that the reasons behind it, and perhaps as well how things could pan out in future GDP calculation figures, and the phases that happens in GDP calculation with regards to growth or contraction, and the pockets locally and nationally that it happens in. And perhaps, like the most important thing is to having that toolkit to decode the patterns and understand the phases and sniff out the real economic story as playing out right where you are, the growth, its effects, its challenges, and its potential. That's where it is. And once you learn how to read the signs, you will start to see them everywhere. So those are the things that we covered over in today's show on the US GDP figures, which do show that the American economy has shrunk by 0.3%. But when they tell you that figure of 0.3%, there is an awful lot that they're not telling you about GDP. And the next time that somebody asks, what do you see outside your window, you might be able to point at something and say, I see a C, I see an I see a G, an N, X, and they won't have an idea what you're talking about, but at least you will. And with that, it takes us to the end of this particular lesson right now. And I wanted to say to everybody that's been tuned in here, what an amazing thing that you've done getting this far, understanding exactly how GDP is calculated and how to interpret the news and the things that you see outside your window. And I'm excited to see what you are able to see for yourself. And I'm looking forward to, of course, having you be in the audience for future shows that I'm doing as I cover the economics lessons that you were deprived at school. And a massive God bless to everybody in the audience. And of course, God bless America and Scotland. At this stage in the show, we're going to move on to the request part. That's we normally do on our show. We'll do a bit of technical analysis, check in with the audience, see how things are going. I tried to deliver quite a big lesson today with regards to GDP, but I always wanted to keep it grounded and reasonable and tie it back to something that you could understand. There's a lot more content that I want to put out on this topic. I think that the idea that the zip code determines your fate more than anything else is something that I could explore in greater detail. And there was an awful lot of them which didn't get the highlight, perhaps, that I'd wanted to give them in today's show, in all honesty. Overall, there was things like the comparison between Palo Alto and Cleveland, which I think was enough to represent it. But there's a lot of different a lot of different elements to this. I mean, can you imagine how the GDP growth would have looked in Flint, Michigan, whenever their taps were going on fire? That was a sign of the lack of GDP growth, which led to the decline in the opportunities for the people that were living there, which led to a decline in the consumption in that local area, which meant that the investment in that local area dropped off. And when the government wasn't able to come in and incentivize investment and motivate that to happen, then what it led to was more job losses and more drop off in consumption, which then led to even less investment in the area, to the point that even the minimum investment required to keep it so that there was no lead going through people's taps and there wasn't explosions happening because of methane had you know, I was going to draw comparisons between different postcodes. Like we've got TS1 there, Middlesbrough in the UK, versus London, you know, SW, where we have for instance, in the southwest of London, where there is the tennis competition every year that you've probably seen on TV, where they play in grass courts and outside in London. That's the Wimbledon postcode. And talk about the difference in figures of GDP growth there for people. I want to talk a bit more perhaps about whether or not it is constant or shifting. And I think that, you know, we covered an awful lot of ground though, and I'm pretty happy with what we've managed to achieve. Tourism in areas in the US are going to be feeling the pain, no doubt. Absolutely. You know, here's a great question to ask, you know, how can banning assault rifles in the United States lead to higher GDP? How could it do it? Well, we could work out perhaps how many tourists are put off going to visit the United States every year as one benchmark figure, and put that up against how much is earned from the sale of assault rifles, for instance. And this is a non-political point about it. I'm not talking about the rights to own things or not, just simply saying on an economic basis, you know, what's the best investment? And how can we make it so that there's new dollars coming into the US? Tourism, big part of that. Tourism where the locals have got assault rifles is less fun from a European perspective, just generally speaking. But, you know, that might be too political for people. It's just what I wanted to say there, is that there are interesting ways that you can see how economics is at the core of so many decisions, and that the emphasis or motivation for making these decisions perhaps can shift in the sands of the wind of opinion, and very easily. And if we start looking at what might make some area boom over some other area, then maybe we need to consider the lifestyle of the people that live there, as opposed to simply considering the tax receipts made from corporation tax. Because let's not forget, you know, the lifestyle in the villages and towns where we see this impact happening isn't improved, and there is some people who have got a slightly better life out of it, sure, some people, and then they go and they take their Instagram photographs drinking orange juice at a bar in Dubai or something like that, and it's like, yeah, okay, so where's the value chain? Where's the growth in the economy? And when these figures then, if they ever do collapse back down the way again, you know, how do you face up to the facts that you know, reorientation of your GDP figures perhaps is necessary in order to recalibrate the way that business is done, because it's not looking at it from a holistic point of view of what really contributes to GDP, because it's never just one thing in and of itself. So it's the balance, and it's the negotiation that happens between these disparate elements that is what really makes the difference. Did I miss something there, by the way? I saw the message that I got from Karen that says that she's enjoying it very much. I saw the message that I got in from Queenie Jeannie, Queenie Janine. Thanks so much. Thanks for the effort you put into educating us, Rocky. Thanks to you too, Jimmy. And hi to chat. Everybody say hi to Queenie Jeannie in the chat box there. We also had Sauce Food Cart. Thanks for you taking part as well there, paying my education tariff while the $1 is still worth something. Appreciated very much. I better take that down to my local exchange fast though, huh? Obi-Wan also super chatted with 10 New Zealand bucks earlier on, saying cheers and thanks for that. It's really appreciated. I have so many other things to do, but Rocky Outcrop and Jimmy streams are a must see. Absolutely. Absolutely. And thanks so much to people for making the chat box super fun to be a part of. It really, really does absolutely enhance things. Absolutely enhance things. So today, folks, we've been talking about your destiny, defined more by your postcode or zip code than your potential or your parents or your degree. And that sounds brutal. It's maybe even unfair. And what we've been doing is breaking down why place holds so much power in today's patchwork economy and understanding the forces shaping opportunity and limiting it. We've been talking about this jarring disconnect that you feel. National news is talking about booms, such as in Palo Alto. You see the headline when you open up the news. Now, not today, because we've seen a contraction. That's the headline, and reality is actually often something completely different. Completely different. You open your curtains and you look outside in Middlesbrough, that's TS1, as I said, or Michigan, Flint, Michigan, zip code 48502. What do you see? You see boarded up shops. You see infrequent buses. You maybe see another for sale sign, but it doesn't look like a boom where you live, despite the fact that GDP is often reported so positively. The widening gap between postcodes isn't just perception, it's the central feature of our modern economy. And how did your particular zip code end up on that crappy or great trajectory? And by the way, it's not to put any sort of shame on the efficient, well functioning economies that attract investment, putting that I figure up. I can pay good wages to their staff, making the C figure go up, where the municipality is able to derive enough taxes from corporation taxes and personal and income taxes and so on to be able to drive even further investment and growth in the G figure, and where they're so kind of self-sufficient, if you like, that they don't even need to import things or whatever. Not that that matters when you talk about the value chain. You import $100 worth of USB cables from China and you sell them for $101. You've contributed $1 to the GDP figure. That's a positive contribution, and that is making things go up. And it's a good thing to do. So imports and exports don't necessarily matter. Your imports would be $100, but your actual contribution to the GDP would be $101, meaning that you had a net increase in GDP of $1 in a situation where NX is 100, but C is 101. Still is a positive GDP. So import and export figures don't actually matter when it comes to GDP. And in terms of the life that you have, if there's more imports than exports, if the value chain exists within that economy. if the value chain exists within that economy, then it doesn't matter if there's a greater import figure. If the C for consumers, the I for investment, and the G for government is spent correctly, then it doesn't matter if NX is negative. The GDP figures, right? They're averages. They're averages. Averages, and that can often make things invisible locally, and it can hide vast differences in wealth and opportunity, the basic quality of life between different postcodes. GDP doesn't tell you about whether or not your ambulance arrives quickly. Doesn't tell you if the internet works reliably, or if you can afford decent housing in your specific zip code. Be it Cleveland or Palo Alto. It measures an aggregate, and it ignores the lived reality within the patchwork. Within the patchwork economy. And this is partly, this is partly because of a legacy. Be it in the US or in the UK or in whatever country in the world that you're living in, possibly with the exception of perhaps of China and India and a couple of others right now, of industrial decline and of policy choices. Many struggling postcodes carry the scar of deindustrialization accelerated by policy choices, which were rooted in free market ideologies. And this is not bashing on free market, because I perfectly understand. Business is going to invest where the business is going to make the best ROI. I absolutely think that that is correct business. But the free market economies can't be relied on alone to make up for certain other aspects of society whenever deindustrialization happens and the loss of manufacturing happens. The fact that manufacturing here in the United States only accounts for 11% or 8% here in the UK of overall GDP figures is relatively low numbers. And of course, it means that there's vastly more wealthy people, better jobs, and so on, doing other things. But it doesn't explain how the figures got to that area, and if people have been disenfranchised by a system that hasn't been able to reskill or retrain them, because the gap between the C of the consumer ability and the I of the willingness of the business to invest in that area wasn't bridged by an unprepared G for government, resulting in a brain drain on that area and the decline in quality of lifestyle, which then led to less consumer, which led to less jobs, which led to less investment, which created a downward spiral, or indeed the virtuous spiral that happens in other places like San Francisco. So the loss of these stable, skilled work jobs fundamentally alters economic bases and social fabrics of places. And it sets postcodes on a different path. And that happened long before today. It happened long before Biden, and it happened long before David Cameron. It happened long before. And while you can look to past governments and say there were failings, the issue is that these are dynamic processes that evolve over time and need to be managed with the future in mind. And then it creates as well superstar cities. We've seen them: London, San Francisco, New York, Tokyo, all the superstar cities in the world. You know that they exist out there, and they attract people, dragging people to the cities from other areas. Beijing, Guangzhou, if you're in China, Mumbai, Delhi, in India. These hubs, growth, hyper concentrated in the superstar postcode, is a reinforcing mechanism that's driven by economic gravity and a word from economics, which, if nothing else, you can take away one word. agglomeration. Agglomeration, that's a real word, which is the name for this effect, which creates these superstar cities, creating hubs, offering opportunity. But, but there is, of course, in these places, a staggering cost of entry and an internal inequality which really can't be ignored by anybody who's thinking about living in one of these places. So, you know, we had the example earlier on about Palo Alto in San Francisco and Cleveland. Like, look at this, you know, it's essentially similar sort of houses. What's the primary difference? 3-bedroom houses. Biggest difference really is their postcode. Whenever you take a step back and you see what's really driving the price of that house. And what is that a measure of? Why would it cost 10, 20 times? You saw 20 times difference, $25,000 versus $4 million. You know, why is that gross difference exists, you know? And it's a measure of how concentrated opportunity is and the wealth that's bidding for it. And even if you move to a thriving postcode, you might find yourself squeezed by the costs, working precariously with your GDP neighbour down there in the city of London on 566 GDP per capita contribution, and you stuck picking up dead rats off the London Underground tracks at less than minimum wage when all things are considered, struggling on under 26,000. And this is a common story affecting hundreds of thousands of people, millions. And that's the Hollywood dream, you know, it's that LA dream. But it's ending up being filmed in a basement. There's a skills mismatch, you know, and there's a need for foundations. To just say, let's retrain, that's simplistic. There's a national pie happening here. It's got a massive recipe that goes into it. It's not just retrain. Also, as well, it's devaluing and undervaluing things. Skills do matter. They need a foundation, and can you rely on the infrastructure in your postcode? Is it offering you opportunity when the bus doesn't arrive to pick you up for work on time? Is the housing affordable? And is the housing only affordable because they know you can't get the bus there? Is the housing only affordable because they know that your kids don't have pavements to play on outside your house? And instead, everybody has to drive a gas guzzler just to get by. Is the housing cheaper because there's no school? And that by you seeking out the only opportunity that the world's giving you is condemning your kids to a negative future? Is that what's going on in your postcode? Because, you know, without childcare being accessible and without people having a functioning lifestyle, you know, GDP just becomes a stupid certificate to say, oh, look, you know, the average is doing all right, so cheer up. You know, you want to be focusing on more than just, there's, you know, the number. They have to look at the place itself. And whether or not that place itself provides the basic infrastructure for success, if it actually gives you a bed to plant your seeds in and to dream of that American dream that the world has been promised since the 1950s. Where is it? Can't see it out that window. Not in certain zip codes. Certainly not in terms of the obvious things. There's a reason why your postcode matters so much, you know? It's to do with those investment flows, which creates these pockets because of investment structures. Capital seeks return in places with skills and networks and reliable foundational infrastructure, which creates high-value jobs, which creates C, which is demand, and the people who are able to buy the concrete because they've got a better GDP thing, giving them enough, or, you know, a good enough GDP thing, plus credit and so on to be able to actually afford to bid with their personal wealth for access to localized patchwork opportunities in an economy which doesn't think about its own CGI NX matrix locally versus its peers with a view to have shared prosperity and mutual wealth growth. Instead, even within places like America and Britain, we look across the divide of Scotland and north of England and London and look at the way that capital flows and how the government creates opportunity and investment, or indeed deprives and takes it away, and how it controls the flows of that over a long period of time and sets us up for opportunity, or indeed to reinforce a particular postcode's advantage over another postcode's disadvantage. And this path dependency locks in your area's fate decades before, when you left the underperforming area and moved to that one that had the better performing schools 20 years ago. Then by the time that your kids are graduating and you're looking and you're asking, why is the quality of education and everything gone downhill here? Things are locked in often decades before you even get to see the outcome of the effects of this stuff. And where does this dynamic, where dynamic investment is scarce, what do we see? We see market failure. Market failure. What does that mean? It means that private capital won't build the needed foundations. Instead, capital might flow into safer, passive investments. Remember the UK buy-to-let example that I showed you. Remember that? Over 400,000 companies just holding property. Does that build prosperity in a zip code? Does it build opportunity in a postcode? Or does it just favour rent extraction over local enterprise? The type of business activity that happens in an area profoundly shapes a zip code's future. Profoundly. What about that brain drain? What about that brain drain? That talent outflow? How a zip code's future potential gets drained away, siphoned away from areas where people grew up wanting to be there, loving it, wanting to be in the area that they're from, but having to move across state and country lines, emigrate away from places that they don't want to emigrate away from in order just to find opportunity. And that's the young people that are doing it, the people with the skills, the modern skills, the ones that are needed and in demand today. They leave the struggling zip code and they seek that opportunity elsewhere, and it erodes the local tax base that's needed to provide local services and infrastructure. And what happens? That accelerates the aging in the area. The overall demographic age in that area increases at a faster rate, faster than the tax base increases, which means there's a signal of decline to potential investors. And ultimately, what happens is it results in that aging population not even having the security that we all worked so damn hard to provide and that they deserved. This becomes a critical mechanism reinforcing why some postcodes stagnate and while others boom. And you got to ask the question then, when you boil it down to just postcodes and how gross domestic product does not match up with the local reality inside your zip code and your postcode, and you want to ask the question, though the obvious question, the question we all want to ask, can your postcode fight back? Local leaders, they try. They've got good intentions most of the time. Most of these local leaders, from whatever coloured political tie that they wear, whatever side of the divide they're on, they've got good intentions. They try. The deck's stacked against them, no matter what their policies are half the time. Although, if they understood the overall the dynamic that's at play, they'd probably put their investment into the most efficient means locally to drive that growth. And what they need to do, of course, is to create that fertile soil for those free market leaders to come in. But, with fiscal constraints and limited powers and piecemeal national policies, we see it here in Scotland all the time. You probably see it where you are, in the area that you are in the States, unless, of course, you're living in downtown New York watching this video, if you are, hit like. And if you're not, which is most of everybody else, they're probably seeing this dynamic right outside your window. Local action, you know, sometimes then can't overcome these economic forces and the flows, the opportunities, the businesses, everything that depends on it. And it becomes a systemic battle, right? Becomes a systemic battle, especially whenever there's a focus on GDP growth as a national policy. And it is. You've seen it. What election has ever been won, ever, without one of the core pillars, central pillars, possibly the number one pillar, almost certainly the number one pillar, like 99% of all elections of all time ever, have looked at GDP as being core to their policy. And how often then is that being reflected back into the local reality of your specific postcode? That's what I'm saying, you know? They're fighting a systemic battle. Local leaders, the government side of things, whenever the decline starts to happen, without the systemic tools or resources to be able to actually do anything. And this creates then this vicious cycle, right? Locking in your postcode's path. This is the engine that locks in your postcode's future, your fate. Your postcode's fate is your fate. And it has a bigger impact on your destiny, your future, your dreams, than your education does. It has a bigger impact on it than your parents. You know, it has a bigger impact on the opportunity than anything else that exists in your life is your damn zip code, all due to these vicious cycles. What's the vicious cycle? Well, it goes like this. The circle, vicious cycles, they work in circles. Job losses. Right? Which goes to lower demand. Which goes to the businesses closing down. Which then leads to a falling tax base. Tax. Leads to a falling tax base. That's your G figure. Which leads to worse local services. I'm going to call that infrastructure. Thinking I was making it easy for myself. Worse infrastructure. Which leads to brain drain. Right? And when there's brain drain in an area, horrible, horrible economic signal to businesses. What does it lead to? Leads to less investment. Right? So you've got a negative profiting signal there. Less investment. And what does less investment lead to? It leads to people losing their jobs, which leads to lower demand, which leads to businesses closing, which leads to a falling tax base, which leads to worse infrastructure, which makes people leave because their town doesn't even have an In-N-Out burger in it, because their town doesn't even have streetlights that turn on at nighttime, because their town doesn't even have a school that's going to teach their kids how to speak properly or do arithmetic. This GDP figure, in fact, is like those education figures. You know that your kid's going to a school which is failing them. But you know also that your kid's school is going to look at the average score that the kids got on their exams just by So a teacher who's a failing teacher can look like a really good teacher just by getting the kids that sit in the first row of the classroom to get A's in their exams. A's at the front and F's at the back means everybody's getting a C, and that's pass marks. But you know what that really is? It's siphoning out the opportunity from people at the back of the classroom and putting it into the people at the front, and leaving the ones at the back to fend for themselves. And that often happens in the same way economically in your very zip code, in this same manner. So job losses, lower demand, lower businesses closes, dropping tax base, worse infrastructure, brain drain. The companies see you leaving the town, doesn't buy a new bus. Right? Let's just start here. Brain drain. Company, you leave town because you're smart and you want a better opportunity. The bus company then says, I'm not buying a new bus because there's not enough passengers, which means one day the bus doesn't turn up. So average Joe loses his job, which means average Joe can't afford to buy anything out of the local pizzeria because there's lower and causes lower demand, which means that the business closes, which means the pizzeria staff and chef and everything's out of a job too. So now they don't even have enough tax to pay between them. Joe's gone, you've left to find a better job. Joe's lost his job because the bus didn't turn up. Pizza shops closed down because Joe didn't have any money to buy pizza. The government then is like, oh, looks like we've not got any income tax. Actually, we can't afford to put the streetlights on at night time anymore. We can't afford to send the audiologist round to the primary schools to make sure the kids can hear. We can't afford to send the optician round to the primary schools to see if the kids can read properly. The kids fail their exams. The school is terrible because their taxes can't afford to provide basic stuff, which is worse infrastructure, which means that one day somebody else just like you packs their bags and leaves. Local investment, poor infrastructure, talent flight, and they feed each other, keeping a postcode trapped in decline, while the opposite happens in the thriving areas. London, San Francisco, New York, Tokyo. Even like, you might think, oh, Georgia, that's not a great state. It's got a lower GDP than San Francisco. Well, Atlanta, it's doing better than the sticks in Georgia. It happens everywhere. You see it everywhere. Understanding the cycle is key to seeing why the superficial fixes that national level governments try to put in place don't work. And they fail when you put superficial national fixes onto specific places. So if you want to be able to make an assessment of your local area and find out whether or not you're living like in the average GDP, or if you're living in the 5.8% area, or if you're living in a 0% or even a negative area, just like the northeast there of England, then you can look towards these factors. Jobs. That's one. Are they well paid? Are they growing? Are they shrinking? Are you looking at the jobs and thinking there's jobs there that are going to offer you a whole career path and add opportunities for advancement and the type of life that you want to live? Or are they not? Local business? It's another factor that you can assess. How are the local businesses doing? Are they dynamic? Are they opening up new shops? Are they just passive chains? Is it just another dollar store from a national dollar store chain? You know, what's missing? What's missing in the matrix of your local business? You know, is it only rubbish restaurants? Is there like nice ones, good ones, bad ones? Are there local businesses which will sell you good quality shoes and poor quality shoes? Or is there no business selling shoes even at all? What have you got there in terms of infrastructure? What's the broadband like? What's the Wi-Fi like? Is it reliable? Are you going to open up a business in that area and rely on that unreliable broadband? Is it good enough for you? How long is your commute? What's that like? What's the commute like? What are the roads like? Are the roads okay? Have they got potholes? You know what? Do you know what city is the biggest pothole city in the entire UK? It's the one I live in, Edinburgh. Got more potholes in this city than anywhere else. What does that say about the GDP in here? What does it say about what people will be thinking come this time next year? Does the guy that's driving a $100,000 car want to have his car drive over a pothole every day on his way to work? Or does he think to himself, you know what, I'm going to apply for that job I saw on the internet in Glasgow? How do all these things fit together? What's your infrastructure like? How fast is your broadband? Have you asked yourself these questions? When you're looking at your window and you're trying to figure out where that GDP growth is for you, and is it happening, and what type of area, what type of postcode you live in, you can ask yourself these questions. You'll figure things out. And it's not just your infrastructure that you're looking at locally, it's services. Services. Quick GP access. What happens when you want to make a doctor's appointment? You phone up for a dentist appointment. When does that toothache end? You're having a heart attack. How quickly will that ambulance arrive? What's it like at the school? Is it thriving? How are the teachers doing? What's the grades like? How many kids go to university from your area? How many kids go to university from your area, get a good job, come back, get that job again, and then set up in that town, in that area? What are the services like? Are the services supporting that? Do the services in your area, such as access to GPs and dentists and opticians and audiologists and chiropractors, schools, firemen? Your house is on fire. Are they going to just let it burn down or not? You've seen going around certain cities in New York, or in like, let's look at Maryland, Baltimore. You drive around the cities, half the houses have got shuttered windows. What's next to Baltimore? Baltimore is basically a suburb of Washington, D.C. How many boarded up windows are you seeing in Washington? How many boarded up windows are you seeing in Baltimore? Where was The Wire filmed? Baltimore. What's the murder rate in Baltimore? Right? How many people are going to die in Baltimore this year? It's the same size city as Edinburgh. You know how many people will die in Edinburgh this year? 20. 20 people tops getting murdered. Tops. You know what? That actually is the whole of Scotland, probably. Yeah. 20. Police murder detectives are not contributing a massive amount to the GDP in Scotland over here. Do you know how many people are going to die? Do you know how many people are going to get murdered this year in Baltimore? Same size city. Same size city. Over 1,000 murders are going to happen. Over 1,000 gun-related crimes alone in Baltimore. What does that say whenever the city next to Baltimore is Washington, D.C.? Where's the opportunity? How does your postcode determine your success versus the success of somebody in Washington, D.C.? How many murders per capita are happening there in the city next to Maryland, or to Baltimore, where The Wire was filmed? How many? Good questions, aren't they? This is how you can tell what's happening. Check those services. See how quickly the police car arrives when you dial 911. Mentioning Baltimore, what's the next thing? Let's take a look at housing. You want to look out your window and see how good the GDP is in your area? What's the housing like? Is it affordable for young people? Is it affordable for local incomes? What about the job? You get paid a teacher's salary in your town. Can you afford a house in your town? Well, are you going to be able to continue teaching in your town if you can't afford to live there? What about whether or not those doors have got boards over them, and that Chris in season 4 of The Wire has dragged in people and shot them in the head with a nail gun? Right? Like in Baltimore, like in the houses that are covered up, with their windows covered up. What's the housing like? What's people flow like? You know, these people that are living in these houses. This is what people could say is brain drain. People flow. So are they staying? Are they going? Are they leaving your specific area? Has the young person that went through the infrastructure on their way to and from school every day, that experienced the service in that area with their rubbish education, who then had to go and get a house that had boarded up windows to then get a job at some local business that doesn't even pay them enough to be able to afford to live in that house. That's going to cause a lot of people flowing out. But is the alternative true? Are you able to afford to live in decent quality housing with decent services where you phone the police and they'll arrive? You need to see the doctor, you won't die. And have you got the infrastructure? Can you make it to your doctor's appointment on time? Because will the bus even turn up? Is there a local business? Can you choose to buy that suit so that you pass your job interview, or do you have to leave town to find just to find a tie? Then you can look at investment, and this is the one thing that people like really look to. And when normally when you're talking about GDP, you've got people will talk about jobs. And what the subtext of what they're really trying to get at is investment. What do you feel like in your local area? Is it invested in or neglected? What's the local park like? Is that local park got flowers in it, or is it all covered in dog shit and broken dreams? There's a postcode lottery out there, folks. So why can your zip code feel like that? Why can it feel actually like your zip code is your destiny? And it's because national averages hide a fractured patchwork economy. That's why. It's because the GDP does not equal the local reality. It's because there's so many things that go into the calculation of the GDP. National averages hide the fractured patchwork economy, which you now understand. And even whenever they show you that things are good, the reality is it often is a Hollywood dream that ends in a basement movie scene where opportunity is increasingly tied to geography, shaped by history, policy choices and economic gravity, skills gaps and underinvestment in foundational infrastructure, market failures, and sometimes a focus on passive wealth over productive enterprise. And if you can see this, you can see the seams and understand why your postcode is on its path. That's the first step to true prosperity. What does it require? It requires building the foundations for a good quality of life and genuine opportunity everywhere, and not just in favoured zip codes. It means looking at the system and tackling the system with systemic tools, and not just looking at the symptoms and juggling elastobands. And only then can we move beyond a postcode lottery and ensure potential and hard work, and not just geography, determine people's futures. And with this information, you are now empowered. And I'm looking forward to seeing how much you're able to grow as a community and as investors and individuals. And I want to hear about your stories and what you see outside your window when you open up the curtains in the morning and look outside. What's the landscape of your economy, and how are you seeing GDP? Let me know about the C, the I, the G, the NX for you. And give yourself a pat on the back, because this type of empowerment comes from within, and you're doing something fantastic by being here and empowering yourself to achieve a better dream, to actually achieve the goals you set yourself and create a better world. And that's why I want to say with my full and open heart, God bless you all. Here's a couple of video choices that might help you if you're looking for some more content. Hit that subscribe and like button, and I'll see you all again next time. God bless everybody. God bless America. God bless Scotland.